The single mom took her daughter to work, didn't expect the Mafia boss's proposal. She scrubbed floors for a living. He owned half the city and buried his enemies without a second thought. She was running from a monster who swore to kill her. He had already lost everything he ever loved and was counting down the days until death claimed him too. But when a desperate mother hiding her sick baby stumbled into the mansion of the most dangerous man in New York, neither of them expected what would happen next. They call him the Phantom because those who cross him simply vanish. Yet this cold-blooded killer who had never shown mercy to anyone found himself unable to look away from an 8-month-old girl with eyes that reminded him of the son he had buried. What happens when the man everyone fears becomes the only one she can trust? What happens when a heart made of stone begins to crack? If you love stories that will make you laugh, cry, and stay up way past your bedtime, subscribe and hit that notification bell right now. Give this video a like if you are ready to fall in love with these characters, and share it with your best friend because trust me, you are going to need someone to talk about this ending. Now, let the story begin. A January night in New York was so cold that breath seemed to freeze the moment it left the lips. Cassidy Reed was kneeling on the floor, scrubbing the restroom when her phone began to vibrate. She glanced at the clock. No one called at that hour unless something was wrong. Her heart tightened when she saw the daycare number glowing on the screen. She hurriedly pulled off her rubber gloves, her hands trembling as she answered. The teacher's voice on the other end was flat and distant, as if she were reading from a prepared notice. Lila had developed a high fever since midnight. The baby wouldn't stop coughing. The daycare couldn't accept a child showing signs of illness. Cassidy needed to come pick her up immediately. Before Cassidy could say a word, the call ended. She sprang to her feet, her head spinning. Lila, her tiny 8-month-old daughter, the only person she had left in this world. Cassidy ran out of the building without telling anyone, throwing herself into the freezing darkness. Snow had begun to fall, white flakes whipping against her face like tiny needles. She ran 3 city blocks because she didn't have money for a taxi. By the time she reached the daycare, her lips had turned blue and her legs had gone numb. Lila lay in the teacher's arms, her face flushed with fever. Her weak cries sounded like those of an abandoned kitten. Cassidy pulled her daughter close, feeling the heat radiating from the small body through the thin layers of clothing. Her child was burning with fever. She carried Lila back to the dilapidated rented room in a Brooklyn slum. The room was barely 10 square meters, the walls stained with damp mold, the window taped over because the glass had shattered long ago. The heater had been broken for weeks. The landlord had promised to fix it, but he never showed up. Cassidy laid Lila on the bed, wrapped her in blankets, then opened the medicine cabinet. It was empty. She had used the last of the fever medicine the week before and hadn't had money to buy more. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she watched her daughter writhe in feverish pain. The phone vibrated again. This time it was the cleaning company. Cassidy answered, and her manager's voice came through sharp and angry. Where was she? Why had she abandoned her shift? Cassidy tried to explain about Lila, about the fever, about needing a day off. The manager cut her off. There was a special job today, a VIP client, a mansion on the Upper East Side. If she didn't show up, she was fired. No exceptions. Cassidy wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the phone against the wall, but she couldn't because if she lost her job, she wouldn't have money for rent, no money for milk for Lila, no money for medicine. She and her daughter would be out on the streets in this brutal winter. And Vance, her violent ex-husband who was hunting her across the city, would find her more easily than ever. Cassidy looked at Lila, drifting in and out of sleep from exhaustion. She had no one to watch her child. Her mother was dead. Friends were gone. She was alone in a city of 8 million people without a single hand to help her. She made the only decision she could. Cassidy dressed Lila in extra layers, wrapped her in 3 blankets, and placed her in the rickety stroller she had bought from a thrift shop for $5. She stuffed a bottle, diapers, and fever medicine borrowed from a neighbor into her bag. Then she pushed the stroller out of the dark room and stepped into the white storm. The address in the message led her to the Upper East Side, where the wealthiest people in New York lived. Cassidy had never set foot there before. She passed spotless streets, luxury storefronts, expensive cars lined along the sidewalks. She felt like a stain on a perfect painting. When she stopped in front of the listed address, her heart nearly stopped. Before her stood a massive mansion, dark as night, with towering iron gates carved with snarling lion heads. Cassidy didn't know that she was standing at the gates of hell, and its owner was waiting inside. Cassidy stood before the iron gate for a long moment, not daring to step inside. Lila fussed in the stroller, her weak cries swallowed by the wind and snow. Cassidy drew a deep breath and pushed the heavy gate. It opened without a sound, as if perfectly oiled, as if inviting its prey to enter. A path of black stone led her through a barren garden. Stone statues stood scattered on both sides, their cold faces dusted with white snow, their hollow eyes seeming to track her every step. Cassidy shivered and pulled the blanket tighter over Lila's face. She walked faster, the stroller wheels clattering against the stone, the sound echoing through the stillness. The mansion's front door was made of massive oak, towering at 3 times her height, carved with intricate patterns she couldn't recognize. Cassidy searched for a doorbell, but found none. She pushed lightly, and the door opened as though the house had been waiting for her. Inside, Cassidy had to pause to let her eyes adjust to the darkness. Then she saw it, and she forgot how to breathe. The main hall was as vast as a cathedral. The ceiling soared high above, with an enormous crystal chandelier suspended in the air. Thousands of crystals caught the faint glow of candles placed throughout the space. The black marble floor shone like a mirror, reflecting her small, lost, dirty figure amid the cold luxury. Flanking the staircase were old oil paintings in gilded frames, noble faces gazing down at her with contempt. Cassidy felt like an ant that had wandered into the palace of gods. No, not gods, demons. Because something about this house terrified her to the bone. The air was heavy and cold, carrying a scent she couldn't name. The scent of loneliness, the scent of pain, the scent of death. A thin layer of dust covered everything, as though the house had been abandoned for years, despite being lived in. Lila broke into a long coughing fit, snapping Cassidy out of her daze. The baby was shivering from the cold. Cassidy needed to find warmth immediately. She pushed the stroller across the hall, her footsteps echoing on the icy stone floor. She opened the first door on the ground level, a vast living room with deep red velvet sofas and a stone fireplace that had long gone cold. She searched for the heater switch and turned it on. Nothing happened. Broken. She rushed into the next room, a dining room with a table long enough for 20 people, empty chairs lined up like ghosts waiting for a feast that would never come. The heater there was broken too. Panic began to rise in her chest. She gathered Lila into her arms and ran up the staircase. The second floor, a guest bedroom, broken. A library filled with thousands of dust-covered books, broken. A recreation room with a billiard table and an old piano, broken. Lila began to cry louder, the sound bouncing through the empty corridors. Cassidy wanted to cry with her. She ran to the 3rd floor, opening door after door in desperation. Then, at the end of the hallway, she found it. A study with a large oak desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and most importantly, a heater that released warm air when she flipped the switch. Cassidy nearly cried with relief. She pushed Lila's stroller into the room and placed it near the heater, but not too close. She removed some layers from her daughter, wiped the sweat from the baby's forehead, and gave her fever medicine. Lila slowly calmed, her heavy eyelids drifting shut from exhaustion. Cassidy let out a long breath and kissed her daughter's forehead. She tucked the baby monitor into her pocket and decided to start working while Lila slept. She needed to finish before the homeowner returned. She didn't want to meet anyone in this haunted house. But fate had other plans. Cassidy didn't know that, as she was scrubbing the staircase on the first floor, a sleek black car had stopped outside the gate, and the owner of the mansion, the man all of New York called the Ghost, was walking into his own home. Cassidy was kneeling on the 12th stair, scrubbing the stone when she heard the crying. Lila's cry, but not her usual cry. It was the cry of fear, the cry of a child who had woken up in the dark and couldn't find her mother. Cassidy dropped the mop and shot up the stairs like an arrow, her heart hammering in her chest, her feet slipping on the polished stone steps. The baby monitor in her pocket made no sound at all. It had broken at some point without her realizing it. She ran through the second-floor hallway and up to the third, her breath coming so fast she felt she might choke. Lila's crying stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the sound itself. Cassidy shoved open the study door and froze. A man stood in the center of the room with his back to her, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long black coat, as dark as night, black hair slightly disheveled, and in his arms was Lila, her daughter, her tiny 8-month-old daughter, resting against the chest of a stranger. Cassidy wanted to scream. She wanted to rush forward and tear her child from his grip, but her feet felt nailed to the floor because she saw something on the desk. A sleek black gun lay cold and silent on the wooden surface. The man was gently swaying, a low shushing sound leaving his mouth. Lila wasn't crying anymore. She was staring up at the stranger's face with wide eyes, one tiny hand clutching his collar. Then the man turned around and Cassidy forgot how to breathe. His face was terrifyingly beautiful, sharp features as if carved from granite, a strong jaw shadowed by a few days of stubble, eyes the color of a storm, cold as a frozen lake in winter. Yet deep within those eyes, Cassidy saw something that held her in place, pain, old pain, deep pain, like a wound that had healed on the surface but still bled underneath. "Who are you?" His voice was low, without anger or threat, only exhaustion and something close to confusion. "I'm Cassidy. Cassidy Reed." Her voice trembled and she had to swallow before continuing. "The cleaning woman. The company sent me. I didn't know you were coming back today." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her tangled hair to her worn shoes, then down to Lila in his arms. "This child, she's yours." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Cassidy nodded, unable to speak. She dared to step forward, her arms reaching out in a silent plea. "She was crying," the man said, still not returning Lila. "I came in, heard her crying, came up here and found her. She was crying alone." "I'm sorry," Cassidy whispered. "She's sick. The daycare wouldn't take her. I don't have anyone to watch her. I need this job. Please don't fire me. I won't bring her again. Please." Cassidy waited for rage, for shouting, for being thrown out of the house immediately. But the man only stood there, looking down at Lila with an expression she couldn't read. How many months? The unexpected question made her hesitate. 8 months. The man closed his eyes. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds. Long enough that Cassidy thought he might never open them again. When he did, something had changed. The gray eyes shimmered strangely, as if holding back something about to break apart. 8 months, he repeated, his voice rough. My son would be 8 months too if he were still alive. Cassidy didn't know what to say. She stood there, tears still falling, watching a stranger hold her daughter as if she were something priceless. Finally, he stepped forward and gently placed Lila into Cassidy's arms, but his hands lingered as if reluctant to let go. When Lila left his embrace, Cassidy saw him swallow hard. "You can bring her here," he said, his voice returning to its earlier coldness. "Whenever you need to. This room is warm enough." Cassidy couldn't believe her ears. "What did you say?" "I said you can bring your child here when you need to." He turned away and walked to the window, staring out at the white curtain of snow. "I'm Ronan Blackwood. This is my house, and I've just given you permission to stay." Ronan Blackwood! The name made Cassidy's blood turn to ice. She had heard it before. Everyone in New York had. The ghost, the most notorious mafia boss on the East Coast, the man whose enemies vanished without a trace. She was standing in the house of a devil, and the devil had just offered her and her daughter shelter. Ronan remained with his back to her, his shoulders rigid beneath the black coat. "I need coffee," he said, his voice hollow and heavy. "Do you know how to make coffee?" Cassidy clutched Lila tightly and nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Yes. Good. Make a pot. I'll be down shortly." He said nothing more. Cassidy carried Lila out of the room, her legs shaking so badly she nearly fell. As she crossed the threshold, Ronan's voice sounded behind her. "Cassidy." She stopped, not daring to turn around. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor." Then silence. Cassidy walked on, holding her daughter close, her heart pounding wildly. She didn't know why the most terrifying man in New York had looked at her child that way. She didn't know why he had let her stay. But one thing she knew for certain, her life had just turned onto a completely different path, and there was no going back. The call came the next morning just as Cassidy stepped back into the damp, rented room. An unfamiliar number. She answered with caution. An older woman's voice came through, calm yet firm. She introduced herself as Elena Rossi, the housekeeper of the Blackwood family. Mr. Blackwood wanted Cassidy to become the official housemaid at the mansion. The salary would be 3 times her current pay, housing included if she needed it. Starting tomorrow. Cassidy nearly dropped the phone. She wanted to refuse. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to stay away from that man. But then she looked at Lila lying on the worn bed, her nose still red from the cold, and at the room with the broken heater, the damp walls, the cockroaches crawling in the dark corners. She thought of Vance, her ex-husband still lurking somewhere out there, waiting for an opening. She thought of the money in her wallet, not enough to buy milk for her daughter next week. "I accept," Cassidy heard herself say. And just like that, the two of them moved into Blackwood Manor. The servants' room was on the first floor, tucked away behind the kitchen. Small but clean, warm with a window facing the garden. Compared to her old place, it was heaven. Lila had a new crib, warm blankets, good milk. For the first time in months, Cassidy slept without fear of being jolted awake by scurrying rats or the landlord's threatening knocks demanding rent. But along with comfort, fear began to grow. In the first days, Cassidy watched everything around her with guarded eyes, and she saw it. Men in black suits moved through the mansion like shadows. They didn't speak to her. They didn't even look at her, but she knew they were always watching. Each of them wore wireless earpieces. Each had a slight bulge at the hip where a gun was hidden. She saw armored black cars parked in the garage, bulletproof glass, license plates that led nowhere. She saw security cameras in every corner, every hallway, every room except the bedrooms and bathrooms. She saw secret meetings in Ronan's study, the door shut tight, low voices seeping out without clear words. One night, Cassidy woke up thirsty. She went to the kitchen and heard voices coming from the living room. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but her feet refused to move. Ronan's voice rang out, cold as steel. "He dared to touch my shipment. Does he think I'm dead?" Another man's voice answered, somehow familiar. "I'll take care of it, Brother Ronan. The Castellanos won't be a problem after tonight." Ronan let out a short laugh. "No need to kill them all, just enough to make them understand who runs this city." Cassidy shuddered. She backed away, trying not to make a sound, but her foot struck a chair leg. The small noise echoed through the silent night like thunder. Silence fell over the living room. Then footsteps. Cassidy froze as Ronan appeared in the doorway, gray eyes cold and fixed on her. Behind him stood a younger man, his face resembling Ronan's but softer, his eyes curious as they studied her. "What did you hear?" Ronan asked, his voice empty of emotion. Cassidy swallowed. She could lie. She could pretend she'd heard nothing. But looking into those eyes, she knew he'd see through her instantly. "I heard enough," she whispered. "Enough to know who you are." Ronan stepped close enough for her to smell expensive cologne mixed with whiskey. He looked her up and down, his gaze unreadable. "And what do you think?" Cassidy drew a deep breath. "I think I knew from the first day. I grew up in Brooklyn. I know Mafia when I see it." Ronan raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Then why did you stay?" "Because I had no choice," Cassidy answered honestly. "And because you haven't hurt me or my daughter." Ronan studied her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and turned to the younger man. "This is Kieran, my brother." Kieran nodded at Cassidy, a friendly smile so different from his brother's cold demeanor. "You're Cassidy," Kieran said. "My brother mentioned you and the baby." Ronan turned away, cutting in. "Go back to your room. Forget what you heard, and don't wander the house at night again." Cassidy nodded and turned to leave, but before she disappeared around the corner of the hallway, Ronan's voice came again. "Cassidy." She stopped. "You're safe here, you and the child. No one is allowed to touch what's mine." She didn't know whether he meant it or was simply keeping her silent. But that night, lying beside Lila as she slept peacefully, Cassidy realized something strange. For the first time in years, she felt protected by a Mafia boss, by a killer, by a man the whole world called the Ghost. 2 weeks passed inside Blackwood Manor. Cassidy gradually grew accustomed to the strange rhythm of life there. During the day, she cleaned, cooked, and took care of Lila. At night, she stayed quietly in her room, pretending not to hear the footsteps, the late-night conversations, the cars arriving and leaving in the darkness. Ronan rarely appeared. He truly was like a ghost, coming and going without anyone knowing. But Cassidy noticed one thing. Whenever he was home, those gray eyes always searched for Lila. He didn't come close. He didn't touch the baby. He only stood at a distance and watched with the expression of someone enduring a nameless torment. One night, Cassidy woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't Lila. The baby was sleeping peacefully in her crib. The sound came from outside her room, from the hallway leading to the kitchen. She opened the door softly and saw a figure standing in front of her room. Ronan. She didn't know how long he had been standing there, staring through the slightly open door at the crib placed near the window. Moonlight fell across his face, and Cassidy saw something she had never seen before. Pain, raw, unhidden, as if in the darkness Ronan no longer needed a mask. "What are you doing here?" Cassidy asked quietly, not wanting to startle him. Ronan didn't answer right away. He kept looking into the room at the small crib where Lila slept. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in a very long time. "She sleeps so peacefully. Caleb never slept like that. He cried at night. Lydia had to stay up all night to soothe him." Cassidy stood still, barely daring to breathe. This was the first time Ronan had spoken his wife and child's names, the first time he had opened the door to his past. "Lydia was my wife," Ronan continued, his eyes still fixed on the darkness. "We married because our families arranged it, 2 Mafia bloodlines forming an alliance. I thought it would be a cold marriage, but I was wrong. She was the only person who wasn't afraid of me. She dared to argue with me, dared to hit me when I spoke out of line, dared to love me, even knowing I was a devil. And when Caleb was born, I thought my life was complete." Cassidy felt her heart tighten. She knew this story wouldn't end well. "The Castellanos." Ronan spat the name as if it were poison. "A rival gang wanted my territory. They knew they couldn't kill me, so they killed what mattered most." He turned to look at Cassidy, and she saw those gray eyes glisten in the moonlight. Lydia was feeding Caleb when they broke in. She grabbed him and ran into the bedroom, trying to hide, but they found her. Ronan's voice broke. He couldn't go on. "She died, holding him in her arms, still trying to shield him even after she was shot. When I got home, I found them lying in a pool of blood. Caleb was still in his mother's arms as if he were sleeping, but he wasn't sleeping." Cassidy didn't realize she was crying until she felt tears sliding down her chin. She wanted to say something to comfort him, but there were no words big enough for that kind of pain. "I killed them all," Ronan said, his voice hollow. "Every last one. With my own hands. I made them beg, made them scream, but it didn't change anything. Lydia was still dead. Caleb was still dead. And I was still alive, still waking up every day in this empty house." He leaned against the wall as if his legs no longer had the strength to hold him. "I went to Germany for 6 months, tried to run away, but I couldn't escape the memories. I couldn't escape Caleb's crying in my head every night. I couldn't escape Lydia's scent on the pillow." Ronan lifted his eyes to Cassidy, and she saw something she never thought she would. Tears sliding down that granite-cold face. The most terrifying mafia boss in New York was crying in front of her. No sobs, no shaking breaths, just silent tears falling, as if he had grown used to crying alone. "Then I met Lila," Ronan whispered. 8 months old, exactly like Caleb would be if he were still alive. And I can't look away. I can't stop looking. Even though every time I see her, my heart feels like it's being torn apart piece by piece. Cassidy didn't know what she was doing until she felt her hand rest on Ronan's shoulder. He flinched under the gentle touch, as if it had been far too long since anyone had touched him with kindness. "It's not your fault," she said, her voice breaking. "What happened wasn't your fault." Ronan shook his head, tears still falling. "I was the husband, the father. It was my job to protect them, and I failed." "No one can protect the people they love from everything," Cassidy said softly, tears running down her own cheeks. "Believe me, I know that feeling. The feeling of not being strong enough to protect. The feeling of failure. But you're still alive. And sometimes, staying alive is the bravest thing a person can do." Ronan looked at her, and for the first time, Cassidy no longer saw the terrifying ghost. She saw only a man shattered by losing everything, just like her. She didn't know who moved first, but in the next moment, Ronan was resting his head on her shoulder, and she was holding him as if he were a crying child. 2 lonely souls in a vast mansion, holding each other in the darkness, sharing pain without needing a single word more. 1 month had passed since that night. Cassidy and Ronan never spoke again about what had happened in the dark hallway, but something between them had changed. The looks lingered longer. The silences were no longer heavy. Ronan began to appear more often during Lila's feeding times, sitting in the corner of the room, watching Cassidy bottle feed her with an expression she couldn't read. Life inside Blackwood Manor, strangely enough, felt more peaceful than anywhere Cassidy had ever lived. She began to forget her fear, began to forget that somewhere out there, a devil was still searching for her. Until that day, Elena asked Cassidy to walk to the grocery store a few blocks away to pick up a few things for dinner. Lila was taking her afternoon nap, and Elena would watch her. Cassidy agreed, even feeling a small sense of relief at the chance to step outside and breathe freely after weeks confined within 4 walls. She put on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and went out. The weather was warmer than the month before, the snow slowly melting and revealing patches of yellowed grass beneath. Cassidy walked to the store, bought everything on the list, and headed back. She was thinking about Lila, about letting her try a new kind of porridge that evening when she saw him, Vance, standing across the street staring straight at her. The familiar face made Cassidy feel like she was going to vomit. Dirty brown hair, bloodshot eyes from too much alcohol, that cruel smile she had seen hundreds of times before every beating. He looked thinner than she remembered, more worn down, but the madness in his eyes was unchanged. "Found you, Cassidy," Vance said, his shrill voice cutting through the quiet street. "You thought you could hide from me." Cassidy dropped the grocery bag. She turned and ran. Her heart slammed as if it would burst from her chest. Her feet stumbled on the wet pavement. She heard heavy, frantic footsteps chasing her from behind. She didn't dare look back. She turned into an alley, hoping it would lead back toward the manor, a mistake. The alley was a dead end. A tall brick wall blocked her path. No escape. Cassidy turned and saw Vance standing at the mouth of the alley, cutting off her only way out. He advanced step by step, slowly like a beast savoring the fear of its prey. "Do you know how long it took me to find you?" Vance growled. 6 months. 6 months. I tore this whole city apart, asked everyone, checked every place, and finally you're here living it up in a rich neighborhood while I was sleeping on the streets." Cassidy backed away until her spine hit the cold brick wall. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from the memories flooding back. Nights beaten black and blue, being dragged by the hair across the floor. The night he punched her stomach when she was 6 months pregnant, nearly costing her Lila. "Vance, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" He laughed, a mad sound echoing in the narrow alley. "I want you dead, Cassidy. You dared to leave me. You dared to humiliate me. You dared to take my child. That baby is mine. You are mine, and no one gets to take what belongs to me." He lunged at her. Cassidy screamed, but the sound was cut short as Vance's hand clamped around her throat. He slammed her against the wall, her head cracking against the brick, stars exploding in her vision. "You thought you could escape me?" Vance hissed, his alcohol-soaked breath burning her face. "You were wrong." He punched her once, twice. Cassidy collapsed to the ground, the taste of blood filling her mouth. She tried to crawl away, but Vance kicked her stomach, making her curl in pain. Lila, that was the only thought in her mind, her daughter. Who would take care of Lila if she died? Who would protect her from this cruel world? She couldn't die here. She had to live for Lila. Cassidy tried to stand, but Vance grabbed her hair and yanked her head back. "You're going to die here," he whispered into her ear. "And then I'll find the baby. I'll teach her what suffering is, just like I taught you." "No!" Cassidy screamed as desperate strength surged through her. She twisted and clawed at Vance's face with everything she had. He screamed in pain and let go. Cassidy lunged toward the alley entrance, but her legs were weak, her head spinning from the blows. She didn't make it far before Vance caught up and shoved her face down onto the ground. He pinned her down, both hands tightening around her throat. "This time, you're not getting away." Cassidy couldn't breathe. She stared up at the gray sky, bright spots dancing before her eyes. She thought of Lila, of her daughter's smile, of the first time she had said "Mama." She didn't want to die. She didn't want to leave her daughter alone. But her strength was fading. Darkness was closing in. Then suddenly the weight on her body vanished. Cassidy coughed violently, dragging air into her lungs. Through her tears, she saw 2 men dressed in black pulling Vance away from her. And standing at the end of the alley, silent like a ghost in daylight, was Ronan Blackwood. His gray eyes were no longer cold. They were burning. A hellfire Cassidy had never seen before. Ronan walked up to Vance, who was being held firmly by the 2 guards. He didn't speak. He only looked. Then he turned to Cassidy, knelt beside her, and gently lifted her up. Her face was bruised, blood streaked from the corner of her mouth. But she was alive. "Who did this to you?" Ronan asked, his voice terrifyingly calm. Cassidy didn't answer. She didn't need to. Ronan looked at Vance and understood everything. He pulled Cassidy into his arms, one hand steadying her, the other wiping blood from her face. "He'll never touch you again," Ronan said, his voice ice cold. "I swear it." Then he signaled to the men in black. They dragged Vance away, his screams echoing and then fading inside a black car parked at the alley entrance. Cassidy didn't ask where they were taking Vance. She didn't want to know. She collapsed against Ronan's chest, sobbing uncontrollably while his arms wrapped around her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Ronan drove Cassidy back to the mansion in silence. She sat beside him in the armored black car, her body shaking uncontrollably even though the heater was turned all the way up. He didn't say a word. He only removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. His cologne surrounded her, warm and strangely safe. When they reached the mansion, Elena was already waiting at the door, her face pale with worry. "Lila is still sleeping," she said. The baby didn't know anything. Cassidy let out a shaky breath. At least her daughter hadn't seen her like this. Ronan took her upstairs to a bedroom on the second floor. Not the small servant's room, but a spacious room with a large bed and windows overlooking the garden. His private doctor was already there, a middle-aged man with steady hands and eyes that didn't ask questions. He treated Cassidy's injuries in silence. Her split lip needed 2 stitches. The bruising around her eye would take weeks to fade. One of her ribs had a small fracture, not serious, but painful with every breath. Cassidy endured it all without crying. She had cried enough. When the doctor left, Ronan remained in the corner of the room, his back against the wall, his eyes never leaving her for a second. He had changed clothes. Cassidy noticed he was wearing something different from the alley, and on the sleeve of his white shirt there was something dark red, like dried blood. She didn't ask whose blood it was. "He'll never look for you again," Ronan said quietly, breaking the silence. Cassidy looked at him and understood the meaning of those words. Vance was dead. The man who had once been her husband, who had beaten her for years, who had nearly killed her and the child in her womb, no longer existed in this world. She waited for fear to come, for disgust, for guilt over a life taken. But nothing came, only relief. A deep relief so overwhelming it made her want to cry. She had lived in fear of Vance for years, afraid of his shadow, afraid of his voice, afraid of his footsteps. And now that fear was gone forever, by the hand of a Mafia boss. "Why?" Cassidy asked hoarsely. "Why did you do this for me?" Ronan didn't answer right away. He walked over to the bed and sat beside her, close enough that she could count his thick black lashes, close enough to see the small scars on his sculpted face. "Because I couldn't save my wife and child," Ronan said, his voice breaking. "But I could save you and the baby." Cassidy felt tears spill over, even though she thought she had none left. Ronan lifted his hand and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His hand was warm. The hand that had killed for her was warm enough to make her want to lean into it and cry. "What kind of man are you?" she whispered. "Someone who kills without hesitation, yet is gentle with a child who isn't his, cruel to his enemies, yet saving a woman who has nothing to give in return." Ronan looked at her, his gray eyes deep as a stormy sea. "I'm a devil, Cassidy," he said. "I've done things you can't imagine. I have more blood on my hands than you could ever count. But with you, with Lila, I want to be someone else. Even if it's only pretending, even if it's only for a moment." "That isn't pretending," Cassidy said, not knowing where the courage came from. "A man pretending doesn't cry the way you cried that night. A man pretending doesn't look at my daughter like she's his entire world." Ronan froze. He looked at her as if she had seen straight through him. Maybe she had. "You should rest," he said, standing as if to leave. But Cassidy's hand caught his sleeve, an instinctive act, a wordless plea. "Stay," she whispered. "Please, I don't want to be alone tonight." Ronan looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then into her eyes, and Cassidy saw the ice wall in those gray eyes crack. He didn't say anything. He simply sat back down beside the bed, then removed his shoes and lay down next to her, keeping just enough distance not to touch, yet close enough for her to feel his warmth. They lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, saying nothing. Cassidy heard her own heartbeat, heard Ronan's steady breathing beside her, heard the wind outside the window. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, "for saving me, for saving my daughter." Ronan didn't reply, but in the night his hand found hers, their fingers threading together, a small connection between 2 broken souls. Cassidy didn't know when she drifted off, but as she fell asleep, for the first time in years, she didn't have nightmares. For the first time, she truly felt safe. Inside the Devil's Mansion, beside the most feared Mafia boss in New York, his hand was still holding hers when dawn finally came. 2 weeks had passed since that night. The injuries on Cassidy's face were slowly healing, leaving only faint bruises that a light layer of makeup could hide. But the greatest change wasn't in her body. It was in the space between her and Ronan. They were no longer simply homeowner and housekeeper. They weren't anything clearly defined either. They were just two people sharing meals in silence, lingering glances, and the occasional accidental brush of hands that made them both shiver. Ronan began coming home earlier. He started eating dinner with Cassidy and Lila instead of alone in his study. He began sitting on the living room floor watching Lila play with the colorful wooden blocks he had somehow ordered from somewhere. He still didn't pick Lila up. He still kept his distance, as if afraid that getting too close would cause him to fall apart. But his eyes never left her. And Lila, guided by the quiet instinct of a child, seemed to sense it. She began crawling toward Ronan whenever she saw him, offering him toys, laughing openly when he was near, babbling meaningless sounds as if trying to speak to him. Ronan froze every time it happened, like a deer caught in headlights, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. That afternoon began like any other. Cassidy was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Lila sitting in her high chair nearby, playing with small pieces of fruit Cassidy had cut for her. Ronan walked into the kitchen, still in his usual suit, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. "A rough meeting?" Cassidy asked softly, having learned to read his mood through the smallest signs. Ronan nodded and sat down across from Lila. He reached for a slice of apple from her plate, but Lila was faster. Her tiny hand closed around his finger, holding it tight, and she giggled. Ronan froze as always, but this time, instead of pulling away, he let it be. He left his finger in her small hand. Cassidy turned to look, her heart tightening at the sight. The most powerful man in New York sat completely still because an 8-month-old baby was holding his finger. Then it happened. Lila looked up at Ronan, her eyes round and clear like crystal. She opened her mouth and a single word echoed clearly in the quiet kitchen. "Papa." Time stopped. Cassidy dropped the knife she was holding. The sound of metal hitting the floor rang out sharply, but no one noticed. Ronan stared at Lila, his face drained of color, as if he had seen a ghost. The baby had no idea what she had done. She just smiled and repeated the word again, cheerful and innocent. "Papa, Papa!" Ronan shot to his feet. The chair crashed backward into the cabinet with a loud bang. He staggered back, gray eyes wide with terror, as if someone had driven a blade straight into his chest. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No, no, no." Then he turned and ran from the kitchen. Cassidy stood frozen for a heartbeat before instinct pushed her forward. She quickly lifted Lila and followed him. He didn't run to his study as she expected. He ran into the living room, stopping in front of the stone fireplace, where a large photograph hung that Cassidy had never truly noticed before. A photograph of a beautiful woman with long black hair and a gentle smile, holding a newborn baby in her arms. Lydia and Caleb. Ronan stood before the picture, his shoulders shaking violently. Cassidy stepped closer and realized he was crying. Not the silent tears from the night in the hallway. This was broken, sobbing grief. The sound of a man who had held everything inside for too long and could no longer bear it. "I don't deserve it," Ronan said through sobs. "I don't deserve to be called a father. I couldn't protect my child. I couldn't save him. Caleb died because of me. Lydia died because of me. And now this baby calls me Papa, as if I deserve that, but I don't. I'm a failure. I'm a killer. I'm a devil." Cassidy set Lila down on the floor and stepped behind Ronan. She didn't know what she was doing, only that she couldn't let him collapse alone. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against his back, feeling every tremor running through his body. "It's not your fault," she whispered. "What happened wasn't your fault." Ronan turned around, his eyes red, his face soaked with tears. He looked at Cassidy as if she were the only light in the darkness, threatening to swallow him whole. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she held him back, letting him cry into her shoulder, letting him release all the pain he had buried for 8 months. Lila crawled over to their legs, looking up at the two adults holding each other. She didn't understand what was happening. She only tugged on Ronan's pant leg and repeated the word once more. "Papa, up." Ronan slowly loosened his hold on Cassidy. He looked down at Lila, tears still streaming down his face. Then, for the first time since Caleb died, he bent down and picked up a child. Lila laughed, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck. "Papa," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ronan held her tightly against his chest and kissed the fine, silky hair on her head. He cried and laughed at the same time, a strange sound Cassidy had never heard before. "Yes," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Papa's here. Papa's here." Cassidy stood watching them, tears running down her face without bothering to wipe them away. She knew this was the moment that changed everything. Ronan was no longer the cold ghost. He was a father learning how to love again. And somehow she had become part of that journey. 1 month had passed since the day Lila called Ronan Papa. Everything inside Blackwood Manor had changed in ways Cassidy never expected. Ronan was no longer a shadow slipping through the hallways. He was present at every meal. He read stories to Lila every night before bed. He learned how to change diapers, how to mix formula, how to soothe her when she cried in the night. To the outside world, he was still the terrifying Mafia boss. But inside this mansion, he was simply a man trying to be a father. Cassidy watched that transformation with a heart full of conflict. She felt warmth every time she saw Ronan holding Lila. She felt her pulse falter whenever their eyes met by accident. But she also noticed something wasn't right. Ronan was growing paler by the day. The dark circles beneath his eyes were deeper. Sometimes she saw him stop mid-step, lift a hand to his head, close his eyes as if enduring an invisible pain. He thought she didn't notice, but she noticed everything. She noticed the pill bottle locked inside the drawer of his study. She saw it by accident when she brought him coffee, catching him as he hurriedly swallowed several white pills. He hid them quickly enough that she pretended not to see, but she had seen them, and she was afraid. That night, as Cassidy was putting Lila to sleep, she heard a loud noise from upstairs, the sound of something crashing to the floor. Her heart tightened. She laid Lila back into her crib and ran to the 3rd floor. The door to Ronan's study was ajar, yellow light spilling into the hallway. Cassidy pushed the door open and froze. Ronan lay on the floor, motionless. Papers from his desk were scattered everywhere. The chair tipped over. A glass of whiskey shattered into 100 pieces. "No!" Cassidy rushed to him and dropped to her knees, lifting his head with both hands. His face was white as paper, cold sweat soaking his forehead. He was breathing, but shallow and uneven. "Ronan!" She shook him, her voice trembling. "Ronan, wake up, please!" He didn't respond. Panic took over. Cassidy called Kieran. Ronan's brother arrived within minutes, followed by the private doctor she had met before. They carried Ronan to the bedroom. The doctor examined him, administered injections. Cassidy stood in the corner, arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to stop shaking. After a while, Ronan slowly opened his eyes. He looked around, taking a moment to understand where he was. Then his gaze settled on Cassidy. In those gray eyes, she saw what she feared most: acceptance, surrender. As if he had always known this moment would come and had no intention of fighting it. "Leave us," Ronan said to the doctor and to Kieran, his voice rough. "I need to speak with her." Alone, Kieran looked at his brother, then at Cassidy, worry written across his face, but he said nothing. He nodded and guided the doctor out, closing the door behind them. Silence filled the room. Cassidy stepped to the bed and sat beside Ronan. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to know what was happening, but when she looked into those exhausted eyes, only one word came out: "Why?" Ronan closed his eyes and drew a deep breath. When he opened them again, she saw that he had made a decision, the decision to tell the truth. "I have a brain tumor," he said calmly, as if talking about the weather. Terminal. Doctors in Germany diagnosed it 6 months ago. They gave me about 6 months to live. Now it's probably closer to 3, maybe less. Cassidy felt as if all the air had been pulled from the room. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could only stare at Ronan with wide, terrified eyes. "No," she whispered. "No, you're lying." Ronan shook his head, a sad smile crossing his lips. "I wish I were lying, but I'm not. That's why I went to Germany. That's why I came back. I wanted to die at home. I wanted to put everything in order before I go." Then you and Lila appeared. He paused and lifted a trembling hand to her cheek. His hand was weak now, no longer the powerful hand of a Mafia boss. "I wasn't going to tell you," he whispered. "I planned to leave without anyone knowing. But then Lila called me Papa. Then you looked at me like I deserved to live, and I don't want to hide from you anymore. I want you to know the truth, no matter how ugly it is." Tears streamed down Cassidy's face. She didn't wipe them away. She just looked at Ronan, the man who had saved her, protected her, given her and her daughter a home, the man Lila called Papa, the man she had begun to love without daring to admit it, and now he was dying. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked through sobs. "Why did you hide it from me?" "Because I didn't want you to look at me like that," Ronan said, his thumb brushing away her tears. "With pity, with grief, I wanted you to remember me as strong, not as a dying man." "You're an idiot," Cassidy said, her voice breaking. "I don't pity you. I hurt for you because I don't want to lose you, because Lila can't lose another person, because I need you." She realized what she was saying, and she didn't care. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, tears falling onto his face. "You can't leave us," she whispered. "Do you hear me? You can't die." Ronan didn't promise. He knew it was a promise he couldn't keep. He only pulled her into his arms and let her cry against his chest, while the shadow of death slowly closed in around them both. 3 days had passed since that night, 3 days in which Cassidy moved through life like a sleepwalker. She still took care of Lila, still cooked, still cleaned, but her mind was always pulled toward the room on the 3rd floor where Ronan was resting under the doctor's orders. He had visibly weakened since the fainting spell. The headaches came more often, more violently. Sometimes Cassidy saw him brace himself against the wall just to stay upright, but he still forced himself up every day, still tried to come downstairs to eat with her and Lila, still tried to smile whenever Lila called him Papa, as if he were wringing out the very last drops of the life he had left. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Ronan called Cassidy into his study. When she stepped inside, she saw him sitting behind the large oak desk, a thick stack of documents spread out before him. He had shaved and was wearing a white shirt, looking almost normal if not for the pallor of his skin and the deep hollows beneath his eyes from lack of sleep. "Sit down." Ronan gestured to the chair across from him. His voice was firm, the voice of a Mafia boss, not the voice of the man who had cried in her arms nights before. Cassidy sat, her hands resting on her knees, waiting. She had a feeling this conversation would change everything. Ronan was silent for a moment, as if arranging his thoughts. Then he looked straight into her eyes and spoke. "I have a proposal. Before you answer, I want you to hear everything." Cassidy nodded, her heart beating faster. Ronan drew a deep breath. "I have assets worth billions of dollars. Real estate, companies, bank accounts in multiple countries. Things that are legal and things that aren't. When I die, all of it needs an heir." Cassidy blinked, unsure where he was going. "Right now, my only heir is Kieran," Ronan continued. "But my brother doesn't want my position. He wants a normal life. He wants out of this world. I have no one else. My parents are dead. My wife and child are dead. I'm the last of the Blackwood line." He paused and pushed the stack of papers toward Cassidy. "This is my will. I want to leave everything to you and Lila." Cassidy stared at the documents as if they were a venomous snake. She shook her head and pushed them away. "No," she said immediately. "I can't accept this. You haven't even heard my full proposal." "I don't need to." Cassidy stood, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm not the kind of person who sells herself for money. I've lived in poverty my whole life. But I have dignity. I don't need your money. I don't want your money." Ronan didn't get angry. He simply looked at her calmly, as if he had expected this reaction. "I'm not talking about selling yourself," he said. "I'm talking about marriage." Cassidy froze. She stared at Ronan, certain she had misheard him. "What did you just say?" "Marry me, Cassidy," Ronan said evenly. "Become my legal wife. When I die, you'll inherit everything by law. No one can challenge it. No one can touch you or Lila. You'll be protected by the Blackwood name, by the power I've built my entire life." "Why?" Cassidy whispered, her legs trembling so badly she had to grip the back of the chair. "Why would you do this?" "Because I'm dying." Ronan stood and walked around the desk to face her. "And before I die, I want to know that you and Lila will be all right. I want to know that no one can ever hurt you. I want Lila to grow up lacking nothing. I want you to have the chance to pursue whatever dreams you have." "But this isn't love," Cassidy said, her voice breaking. "You don't love me. You're just trying to replace Lydia." Ronan looked at her, and in his gray eyes she saw something that made her want to cry. "No one can replace Lydia," he said softly, "just as no one can replace Caleb. But you aren't a replacement, Cassidy. You're you. Lila is Lila, and I care about you in my own way. Maybe it isn't love. Maybe it's gratitude for bringing light into this dead house. But whatever it is, I want to spend my last days protecting you." Cassidy cried, tears streaming freely down her face. This was the most insane thing she had ever heard. Marrying a dying mafia boss, inheriting billions from a man she had known only a few months, becoming the wife of the ghost. But then she thought of Lila, of her daughter's future, of what would happen if she died and Lila ended up in an orphanage, of the poverty she had endured and never wanted her child to suffer. That thought made Cassidy want to scream. "If I agree," she whispered, "what happens then?" Ronan lifted his hand and gently wiped the tears from her cheek. "You'll become Cassidy Blackwood. Lila will become Lila Blackwood. I'll legally adopt her. You'll have access to all my accounts. You'll have lawyers, security, everything you need. And when I'm gone, you'll be the most powerful woman on the East Coast of America." Cassidy closed her eyes. Her mind spun. Part of her wanted to refuse, to cling to the dignity she had fought to keep for so many years. But another part, the part that was a mother, knew this was the only way to secure her daughter's future. "I need time," she said, "to think." Ronan nodded. "You have 1 week." He lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "But whatever you decide, I won't send you away. You and Lila will always have a place here. That's a promise." Cassidy nodded and turned to leave. As she reached the door, Ronan's voice sounded behind her. "Cassidy." She stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you," he said, his voice softening, "for not refusing right away. Thank you for giving me hope." Cassidy didn't reply. She stepped out, closed the door, and leaned back against the cold wall. In her mind, only one question spun endlessly. Could she marry a devil to save her angel? 1 week passed like a never-ending nightmare. Cassidy couldn't sleep. Every night she lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady sound of Lila breathing in her crib, and thinking, until her head felt like it might explode. She thought about her life. Born into poverty, a mother who worked herself to exhaustion in factories, a father who left when Cassidy was too young to even remember his face. She grew up with meals that were never enough, clothes that were always secondhand, and a dream of becoming a teacher that she never had the money to pursue. Then she met Vance. She thought he would be her escape. Instead came years of hell, beatings, nights spent crying alone. And now she was here in the mansion of a dying mafia boss being proposed to not for love, but for a will. She thought about Lila, her tiny daughter, barely 9 months old, knowing nothing of the brutal world outside. If Cassidy died, what would happen to Lila? She would end up in an orphanage. She would grow up deprived just like Cassidy had. She would live a life of hardship like her mother, or worse. That thought made Cassidy want to scream. She thought about Ronan, the man all of New York feared, a cold-blooded killer, a mafia boss without mercy, but also the man who cried when he spoke of his wife and child, the man who killed Vance to protect her, the man who held Lila with a tenderness she had never seen in anyone else, the man who looked at her as if she had value, as if she deserved to be protected. On the 6th night, Cassidy stood outside Ronan's door. Through the narrow opening, she saw him sitting alone in the dark, staring at the photograph of Lydia and Caleb. His shoulders trembled, and she knew he was crying. Alone, as he had been for 8 months. And she realized something. Ronan didn't need an heir. He needed a family. He needed someone to hold his hand in his final days. He needed Lila to call him Papa. He needed her to stay. And maybe, just maybe, she needed him too. On the morning of the 7th day, Cassidy knocked on the door to Ronan's study. He opened it, gray eyes meeting hers with expectation, and something that looked like hope, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. "I agree," Cassidy said, her voice steadier than she expected. Ronan didn't speak. He just stood there staring at her as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. "But I have conditions," Cassidy continued, stepping inside and facing him. Ronan crossed his arms, tilting his head as he waited. "What conditions?" "No pretending," Cassidy said, looking straight into his eyes. "If we marry, we are a real family. You eat dinner with us every day. You read to Lila every night. You don't hide it when you're in pain. You don't suffer alone. You live the days you have left as a father, as a husband, not as a shadow, not as a man waiting to die." Ronan studied her for a long time. In those gray eyes, Cassidy saw emotions pass one by one. Surprise, emotion, and something warm she didn't dare name. "You know what you're asking of me," he finally said. "You're asking me to open my heart, to love, to hurt more when I leave." "I'm asking you to truly live before you die," Cassidy replied without hesitation. "That's my condition. If you can't accept it, I won't sign anything." Silence stretched on. Cassidy began to think he would refuse, that he would withdraw the offer, that she had gone too far. Then Ronan stepped in front of her, close enough that she could feel his breath on her lips, close enough to count the early strands of gray at his temples. Then he bent down and kissed her forehead softly, gently, like a vow more sacred than any spoken oath. "I agree," he whispered, his lips still resting against her skin. "I'll truly live for you, for Lila, for this family." Cassidy closed her eyes and let the tears fall. She didn't know what the future would bring. She didn't know if this decision was right or wrong, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was walking toward the light, even if that light came from the hand of a devil. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the garden behind the Blackwood mansion. There were no lavish guests, no press, no reporters, only Kieran, Elena, and a handful of Ronan's closest people. This was the wedding of the ghost, and a ghost didn't need the world to witness it. Cassidy stood before the mirror in the room Elena had prepared for her, looking at the woman reflected back and barely recognizing herself. The ivory white wedding dress was simple yet elegant, chosen personally by Ronan, fitting her body as if it had been tailored just for her. Her hair was swept up, revealing her slender neck and the pearl earrings he had given her that morning. She looked like someone else. She looked like a happy bride. She looked like her life hadn't been an endless chain of suffering. The door opened. Cassidy turned and saw Ronan standing there dressed in a classic black suit, no tie, the top button undone to reveal the skin at his throat. He was so handsome she forgot how to breathe, and he was looking at her as if she were the sun after a long winter. "You're beautiful," Ronan said, his voice rough. "You don't need anything at all, and you're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." Cassidy felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't used to being praised like that, wasn't used to that look. "You don't look bad yourself," she replied, trying to sound calm while her heart raced wildly. Ronan smiled, a rare smile that softened his cold features in a way that felt almost unreal. He stepped forward and held out his hand. "Let's go, my fiancée." Cassidy placed her hand in his and let him lead her into the garden. The ceremony was held beneath an arch of white flowers. Soft golden lights glowed like falling stars in the night. Lila sat in Elena's arms, wearing a tiny pale pink princess dress, a white bow in her hair, clapping happily without understanding anything that was happening. The officiant read the familiar words, but Cassidy didn't hear them. She only looked at Ronan, and Ronan only looked at her. When it came time for the vows, the officiant said Ronan could speak his own. He nodded, turned to face Cassidy, and took both her hands in his. "Cassidy," he began, his voice low but steady, "I don't promise forever, because I don't have forever to give. I don't promise to be with you until we're old and gray because my time is limited. But I promise this. Every day I have left belongs to you and Lila. Every breath I have left is to protect you. Every remaining beat of my heart is for you. I promise to love you with everything I have and everything I am. Even if the time is short, even if I don't deserve it, I promise to live, truly live, until I no longer can." Tears streamed down Cassidy's face. She didn't try to stop them. She only squeezed his hands tighter, feeling the slight tremor in those powerful fingers. She had prepared her own vows. "Ronan," she said, her voice shaking but determined, "I come to you with empty hands, with nothing but a small child and a heart full of scars, but I promise to stay by your side. Not because of money, not because of protection, but because you showed me that even in the deepest darkness there can still be light. I promise to be your family, to be the hand you hold when you're in pain, to be the arms you lean on when you're tired, to be the one who stays with you until the end." The last words caught in her throat. But Ronan understood. He nodded, tears falling down his own cheeks. "Until the end," he repeated softly. "That's enough." When the officiant declared them legally husband and wife and said the groom could kiss the bride, Ronan gently lifted Cassidy's chin. He kissed her slowly, tenderly, with reverence, as if she were the most precious thing he had ever touched. Cassidy closed her eyes and returned the kiss, forgetting everything around them. "Papa, Mama!" Lila's voice broke the sacred moment, making them both pause and laugh. She was waving her hands, asking to be picked up. Ronan lifted Lila into his arms and kissed her forehead. "That's right, little princess," he whispered. "Papa's here, Mama's here, and now we're a family, a real family." On their wedding night, Ronan didn't touch Cassidy right away. He simply lay beside her, holding her from behind, his lips brushing her shoulder. They lay there in the dark, listening to each other's heartbeats. "Thank you," Ronan whispered into her ear, "for giving me a family in my final days." Cassidy turned in his arms, looked into his deep gray eyes, and kissed him, not softly and cautiously like during the ceremony, but with passion and longing, as if trying to say everything she couldn't put into words. That night they made love for the first time, slowly, gently, full of emotion. And as Cassidy lay in Ronan's arms, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, she whispered for the first time the truth she had felt for so long. "I love you, Ronan." Ronan held her tighter and kissed the top of her head. "I love you too." They both knew time was running out, but tonight, in a room filled with moonlight, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was all they needed. 2 months after the wedding became the most beautiful time of Cassidy's life. The Blackwood mansion was no longer a cold fortress. Lila's laughter echoed through the hallways. Tiny footsteps pattered across the wooden floors. The sound of Ronan pretending to growl as he chased her like a bear made Lila shriek with delight. These were the sounds the house had been missing for 8 long months, and now they had returned. Ronan changed in ways even Kieran couldn't believe. The most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast now sat on the floor building blocks with his 9-month-old adopted daughter. He learned how to cook porridge for Lila, even though the first batch burned horribly. He woke at 3 in the morning when she cried at night and walked her around the room until she fell asleep again. He sang lullabies in a low, rough voice, and even though he couldn't sing well, Lila still smiled in her sleep. To Cassidy, Ronan was nothing like the ghost she had heard about. He brought her coffee every morning. He remembered she liked 2 sugars and a little milk. He ordered books about education and child psychology because he knew she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher. He sat and listened to her talk about that dream for hours, his gray eyes watching her with a respect she had never received from anyone before. One night after Lila had fallen asleep, Ronan led Cassidy into his study. On the desk sat a new computer and stacks of textbooks. "You start next week," he said. "Online university, 4 years. I've paid the full tuition." Cassidy froze, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Ronan, I can't." Before she could refuse, he placed a finger over her lips. "You're my wife. Your dream is my dream, and I'll do everything to make it real. The day you graduate, the day you stand in front of a classroom teaching children, I want to be there. Even if only in your thoughts, even if only in your memories." Cassidy cried. She held Ronan tightly and sobbed with happiness, because for the first time someone believed in her that much, because for the first time she dared to believe she deserved to be loved. The days that followed passed like a dream. They ate breakfast together on the balcony overlooking the garden. They took Lila to the park on weekends, Ronan wearing a hat and sunglasses so he wouldn't be recognized. They cooked together in the kitchen, Cassidy teaching Ronan to make pasta using her mother's recipe, while Ronan spilled tomato sauce all over the floor and had to clean for an hour. They laughed a lot. Laughter filled the mansion, chasing away the darkness that had lingered there for far too long. At night they lay together, Ronan telling her about his childhood, about the years building his empire, about Lydia and Caleb. He no longer cried when he spoke of them. He talked about them with peace, as if he had finally learned to accept the loss. Cassidy told him about her mother, about her dream of being a teacher, about the years with Vance she had never spoken of to anyone. Ronan listened to every word, his hand constantly stroking her hair, his lips occasionally pressing a kiss to her forehead as if trying to erase every wound of her past. "I wish I had met you sooner," Ronan whispered one night. "I wish I had more time to love you." "We have now," Cassidy replied, her hand cupping his face, "and now is all we need." She knew Ronan was counting down each day. She knew the headaches were still coming more often, more violently. She knew he hid painkillers in a drawer so she wouldn't worry. But she didn't say anything. She simply stayed with him, held his hand every night, loved him every day as if tomorrow would never come. Because for them, tomorrow was a luxury they couldn't be sure they would have. The call came one afternoon while Cassidy was feeding Lila in the kitchen. An unfamiliar number. She almost didn't answer, then changed her mind at the last second. The voice on the other end made her freeze. Brooke, her only real friend from her days at the cleaning company. The one who had helped her find work when she first ran from Vance. The only person who knew about the violence in her past. "Cassidy, I finally found you," Brooke said lightly. "I hear you've made it big. I want to come see you. Is that okay?" Cassidy hesitated. She hadn't contacted anyone from her old world since moving into the Blackwood Mansion, partly because she'd been busy, partly because she didn't know how to explain any of this. But Brooke was her friend, the only person who had cared when she had nothing. She couldn't say no. Brooke arrived the next day. When the taxi stopped in front of the mansion gates, Cassidy saw her friend standing there, staring at the house as if it were a palace from a fairy tale. Brooke's eyes widened as they swept from the towering iron gates to the statues in the garden to the massive 5-story building. "Oh my God," Brooke breathed when Cassidy came out to greet her. "You really live here." "This is my husband's house," Cassidy replied, keeping her voice steady. "Come in. I'll show you around." Cassidy led Brooke through the mansion, introducing each room. She tried to be enthusiastic, tried to be cheerful the way they used to be together, but she felt it. Something had changed. The look in Brooke's eyes wasn't the look of a friend anymore. It was calculating, measuring, envious. When they sat down in the living room, Lila playing on the floor nearby, Brooke finally spoke. "So you sold yourself to him." The question hit Cassidy like a bucket of ice water. She blinked, not believing what she'd heard. "What did you say?" "I asked if you sold yourself to that Mafia guy." Brooke shrugged, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Everyone in the city knows who Ronan Blackwood is, a Mafia boss, a killer, and you, my poor cleaning lady friend, are now his wife. You think I'm stupid enough not to understand what's going on." "This isn't what you think," Cassidy said, struggling to keep the anger rising in her chest under control. "Ronan and I love each other." "Love?" Brooke scoffed. "You call that love? A woman who scrubs toilets falling in love with a Mafia billionaire. Sounds like a fairy tale. Be honest, Cassidy. How much did he pay you? Or did you just have to spread your legs to get all of this?" "Shut up." Cassidy jumped to her feet, her voice shaking with rage. "You don't know anything about me or Ronan. You have no right to judge." "I don't know anything?" Brooke stood too, her eyes cold. "I know you, Cassidy. I know what kind of person you are, always complaining about being poor, always playing the victim. And now you've found a rich idiot to use. I have to admit, you're good, better than I ever thought." Brooke paused and glanced at Lila on the floor, unaware of the adult's argument. "That poor child," Brooke said bitterly. "One day she'll know her mother is the kind of woman who sells herself to the Mafia. She'll be so proud." The slap echoed through the living room. Cassidy didn't realize what she'd done until she saw her hand still raised and Brooke's cheek flushed red. It was the first time in her life she'd ever hit anyone, and she didn't regret it. "Get out of my house," Cassidy said, her voice icy. "Get out right now." "You'll regret this," Brooke hissed, clutching her cheek. "You're throwing me out for a Mafia bastard. I'm your only friend." "Friends don't say what you just said," Cassidy replied, tears streaming down her face but her voice steady. "Friends don't judge when they don't understand. Friends don't insult their friend's child. You're not my friend. Maybe you never were. Leave." Brooke stared at her for a moment, then laughed harshly. "Fine, I'm going. But remember this, Cassidy. When he gets tired of you, when he throws you out on the street, don't come crawling back to me." Then she left, her heels clicking against the stone floor, the door slamming shut behind her. Cassidy stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, then slowly sank to the floor. Tears poured out of her uncontrollably. Lila crawled over, her tiny hand touching Cassidy's cheek, her face worried. "Mama, cry." "It's okay, baby." Cassidy pulled her into her arms, forcing a smile through the tears. "Mama's okay." But she wasn't. She had just lost her only friend, the person she thought was a friend, and it hurt more than she'd expected. Ronan came home that evening and found her sitting alone in the dark living room. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply sat beside her and pulled her into his arms, letting her cry on his shoulder. Later, Kieran told him everything. Ronan listened, his face unreadable, but his gray eyes darkened. "She didn't deserve to be your friend," he whispered into Cassidy's hair. "Real friends don't hurt each other like that. You have me. You have Lila. You have this family. That's what matters." Cassidy looked up at him, tears still clinging to her lashes. "I know," she whispered. "It just hurts realizing she never really cared about me." Ronan kissed her forehead. "I care," he said softly. "I'll always care, and you'll never be alone again." That night, Cassidy slept in Ronan's arms, and though the wound from the betrayal still ached, she knew she had finally found where she truly belonged. 3 weeks passed since the day Brooke walked away. The wound left by that betrayal slowly healed, and Cassidy focused on the only thing that truly mattered: her small family. Ronan was visibly growing weaker. The headaches came more often, more violently. Sometimes he had to stop in the middle of walking, brace himself against a wall, close his eyes, and wait for the pain to pass. He tried to hide it, but Cassidy saw everything. She saw the number of pill bottles multiplying in the drawer. She saw the nights he lay awake, unable to sleep. She saw his skin growing paler with each passing day, and she knew time was running out. That morning began like any other ordinary morning. They sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast, Lila playing with her oatmeal, smearing it all over her face and hair. Ronan laughed and helped Cassidy wipe the baby's cheeks. And in that moment, he looked almost healthy, almost normal, almost as if he wasn't dying. Then Ronan's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and froze. An international number, a German country code. Cassidy watched his face drain of color. She knew it was the hospital where he'd been diagnosed. She knew this call could carry the news she feared most. "Answer it," she said softly, even as her heart pounded wildly. "I'm here." Ronan looked at her for a second, then put the call on speaker. A man's voice came through, speaking English with a distinct German accent. "Mr. Blackwood, this is Dr. Weber from the Berlin hospital. I need to speak with you about an extremely urgent matter." Ronan tightened his grip on Cassidy's hand beneath the table. "I'm listening," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. "My wife is here. She knows everything." There was a brief pause on the line. Then Dr. Weber continued, his tone heavy. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't know how to say this. There has been a mistake, a serious mistake in our laboratory." Cassidy felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. "What kind of mistake?" Ronan asked, his voice rough. "Your test results were switched with those of another patient," Dr. Weber said, each word landing like a bullet. "That man, the patient who actually had the brain tumor, passed away 2 weeks ago. We only discovered the error during a routine file review." Silence followed. A crushing silence so heavy Cassidy could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "What are you saying?" Ronan whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm saying you don't have a brain tumor, Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Weber replied, filled with remorse. "You never did. We've rechecked the results 3 times. You're completely healthy. This is an unforgivable error on our part, and I deeply apologize for what you've endured over these past months." The phone slipped from Ronan's hand and struck the table with a dull sound. He stared at Cassidy, his gray eyes wide, as if his mind couldn't process what he'd just heard. "I'm not sick," he whispered, sounding dazed. "I'm not dying." Cassidy couldn't speak. She just looked at him, tears streaming down her face without her realizing it. Her mind refused to accept the truth. It couldn't be real. After all the nights she'd cried, believing she was going to lose him, after all the days she'd forced herself to treasure every moment because time was supposed to be running out, after all the vows, the kisses, the nights they held each other as if tomorrow would never come, all of it had been caused by a mistake, a lab error. Ronan hadn't been dying at all. "You're not dying," Cassidy repeated, her voice breaking. "Ronan, you're not dying." And then she collapsed into tears. She cried like she'd never cried before. She cried from relief. She cried from joy. She cried because all the fear she'd carried for months dissolved in a single phone call. Ronan shot to his feet, the chair crashing backward behind him. He looked at Cassidy, then at her belly, then back at her face, and the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast broke down and cried like a child. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she couldn't breathe. But she didn't care. She wrapped her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder, feeling his body tremble with emotion. "I'm not dying," he kept repeating against her ear as if he needed to hear the words to believe them. "I can stay with you, with Lila. I can watch her grow up. I can take her to school on her first day. I can watch you graduate. I can live, Cassidy. I can live." Lila began to cry, maybe because she felt abandoned, maybe because the sight of two adults laughing and crying at the same time frightened her. Ronan released Cassidy and went to Lila's high chair, lifting her into his arms. He spun in a slow circle with her, tears still running down his face but wearing the brightest smile Cassidy had ever seen. "Papa is staying, my little princess," he said through a broken laugh. "Papa will watch you grow up. Papa will scare away any boys who get too close. Papa will cry at your wedding. Papa will be here, Lila. Papa will always be here." Lila didn't understand any of it. She only laughed, clapped her hands, and shouted happily, "Papa, Mama, happy!" Cassidy stepped forward and wrapped her arms around both of them. The three of them stood there in the kitchen, flooded with morning sunlight, holding each other, crying, laughing as if the outside world no longer existed. And for the first time, Cassidy wasn't afraid of tomorrow, because tomorrow belonged to them. All the tomorrows belonged to them. 2 months had passed since that fateful call. 2 months in which Cassidy still had to remind herself every morning that this was real. Ronan was healthy. Ronan was going to live. Ronan would stay with her and Lila for the rest of their lives. That truth changed everything. Ronan sued the hospital in Germany, not for compensation, but to make sure such a mistake would never happen to anyone else again. The hospital agreed to overhaul its entire testing process, dismiss those responsible, and implement stricter cross-checking systems. Ronan didn't need their money. He only needed to know that no one else would have to live through the hell he had endured for so many months. But the greatest change was within Ronan himself. He began withdrawing from the underworld little by little, one operation at a time. He handed the illegal businesses over to Kieran to manage, while gradually transforming them into legitimate enterprises. Casinos became luxury hotels. Smuggling routes became logistics companies. Money laundering turned into investment funds. Kieran was surprised, but supportive. He had always known his brother would do this one day. "You just needed the right reason," Kieran told him during a meeting. Ronan glanced at Cassidy sitting in the corner reading while Lila slept in her arms. "I found 2 reasons," he replied, "and I won't risk losing them for anything." Cassidy began her online university studies just as Ronan had arranged. At first she was anxious, afraid she'd been away from books for too long, afraid she wasn't smart enough, afraid she would fail. But Ronan was always there. He sat beside her while she studied. He made coffee for her on nights she stayed up late preparing for exams. He read her essays and told her she would be the best teacher he'd ever seen, even though he'd never once seen her teach. When the results of her first exams came back, Cassidy had earned the highest score in her class. She cried when she saw the grades. Ronan held her, kissed her forehead, and told her he had never doubted her for a single second. Life in the Blackwood mansion was completely different now. There was no darkness, no fear, only Lila's laughter echoing through the halls, Ronan's voice reading bedtime stories each night, Cassidy's soft singing as she rocked their child to sleep. The sounds of a real family. Lila was walking steadily now, running through the garden with Ronan chasing after her. She called Papa and Mama clearly, spoke short sentences, and had developed a habit of hiding Ronan's shoes every morning just to make him look for them. Ronan pretended to be annoyed, but his eyes always shone with happiness whenever he looked at his daughter. One morning, Cassidy woke with a wave of nausea. She rushed to the bathroom, retching, and when she lifted her head to look at herself in the mirror, a thought flashed through her mind. She counted the days and realized she was more than 2 weeks late. Her heart pounded as she took the pregnancy test she had hidden in the cabinet for over a week, too afraid to use it. But today, she had to know. The 2-minute wait felt like 2 centuries. Then the result appeared. 2 clear red lines. Cassidy stared at the test, then looked again, hardly daring to believe it. She was pregnant. She and Ronan were going to have a child, their own child. She stepped out of the bathroom on trembling legs. Ronan was sitting on the bed, just waking up, hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep. "What's wrong?" he asked when he saw her face. Cassidy said nothing. She simply held out the test. Ronan looked down and she watched his gray eyes widen, then widen even more, then fill with tears. "You're pregnant," she whispered. "We're going to have a baby, Ronan." Ronan dropped the test. He looked at Cassidy, then at her belly, then back at her face, and the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast broke down and cried like a child. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she couldn't breathe, but she didn't care. She wrapped her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder, feeling his body tremble with emotion. "I'm going to have a child," he said through sobs. "My child, my blood. And this time I'll be here. I'll protect them. I won't lose them like I lost Caleb." Cassidy held him and cried with him. From happiness, from gratitude, from the overwhelming realization that life had given them a second chance they had never dared to dream of. 1 year later, spring had returned to the gardens of the Blackwood estate. Colorful tulips bloomed along the stone paths, and warm sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering shimmering patches of light across the lush, green lawn. In the middle of that peaceful scene, a small family sat on the grass, savoring a quiet weekend afternoon. Lila was nearly 2 now, her soft black hair tied into 2 tiny braids, her blue eyes bright like her mother's. She ran through the garden picking flowers, bringing them to Ronan one by one, calling out, "Papa, pretty flower." Ronan sat on the grass, accepting each blossom from his daughter as if it were a precious jewel. He had changed completely. He was no longer the ghost that all of New York once feared. Now he was simply a father placing flowers in his wife's hair, a husband gazing at his family with eyes full of peace and gratitude. Cassidy sat beside him, one hand resting on her 4-month pregnant belly, already gently rounded. Inside her was their child, the living proof of a love neither of them had ever believed they deserved. The doctor had said it was a boy. Ronan had cried when he heard the news, cried from happiness, from gratitude, from the overwhelming realization that life had given him another chance to be a father. On a small table near them lay a freshly signed set of documents, the adoption papers. Lila Blackwood. Her name was now official, printed on legal documents. She was no longer Vance Reed's child. She was Ronan Blackwood's daughter, chosen, protected, and loved by a father who had claimed her with his whole heart. "I still can't believe our life," Cassidy whispered, leaning her head against Ronan's shoulder. "A year ago, I was scrubbing bathroom floors, running, living in fear every day, and now I'm here. I have a family. I have love. I have a future." "I feel the same," Ronan replied, his hand gently stroking her hair. "A year ago, I thought I was going to die. I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never be able to love anyone again. Then you and Lila appeared, and everything changed." Lila ran back to them and climbed into Ronan's lap, still clutching a wilted flower she'd squeezed too tightly. "Papa, Mama, love." She kissed both their cheeks, leaving streaks of dirt and grass on their faces. Neither of them cared. Ronan wrapped his arms around his wife and daughter and looked up at the clear blue sky. He was no longer the ghost. He was a father, a husband, a man who had finally found the meaning of life after years lost in darkness. "I love you both," he whispered, "more than anything in this world." Cassidy lifted her face and kissed him softly. "We love you too, forever." And as the sunset bathed the garden in golden light, the 3 of them remained there, holding one another, no more words needed, because sometimes happiness doesn't need to be spoken. It only needs to be felt, lived, cherished, moment by moment. Ronan and Cassidy's story stands as proof of that. That light can be found in the darkest places. that love can grow from the most barren ground, that it's never too late to begin again, that family isn't blood but the people who choose to stay through the storm, and most importantly, that every day we're alive is a precious gift worth honoring. Life may lead us into dark alleys. It may throw obstacles at us that seem impossible to overcome. But as long as we don't give up, as long as we dare to believe in tomorrow, the light will come. Maybe from where we least expect it. Maybe from the hand of someone we never imagined would save us. But it will come. And that's the message this story wants to share with all of you. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss new videos every day. Leave a like if you enjoyed the content, and don't forget to share this video with someone you care about. We'd love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever faced moments that felt impossible only for life to surprise you in the end? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Every comment you leave is a powerful motivation for us to keep creating more meaningful stories. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.